This is a very interesting research study. You may know it, but there are about 260 students, but in this analysis I'm going to compare the highest achieving 5 or 6 children with the lowest achieving 5 or 6 children in each class. So there were 12 classrooms. Each teacher in each of the 4 schools taught 3 classes. So the teachers were the same for the 3 classes in the school, but they treated them differently. So they taught them the same, they used the same curriculum scheme, the same teaching, the same aims, but for the 3 classes each teacher taught, they gave different feedback. So for one of the classes for each teacher, they gave them a score on the piece of work they'd just done. Worst piece of work was given a score of 40, best piece of work was given a score of 99. For the second class, instead of a score, they gave a comment. You thought of lots of good examples here, maybe you could think of a few more. Very kind of informal. Not particularly diagnostic or revealing comment. In the third class for each teacher, the feedback consisted of the score and the comment side by side. So the children came into the lesson, picked up their exercise books, looked inside, the feedback, carried on working. And so the question is, what was the eventual achievement of the children in this experiment? The children given scores made no progress. They were given a pre-test and a post-test. Their post-test scores were the same as their pre-test scores. So on average, they learned nothing. And when they asked the children, do you want to carry on with this work? The ones who got high scores said, yes, please. And the ones who got low scores said, no, thank you. The children given comments, their scores went up by 30%. They didn't know that, of course, because they didn't see their scores. But their post-test scores were higher than their pre-test scores. And when they asked the students, do you want to carry on with this work? All the students were positive about carrying on. So what I want to ask you is, what do you think happened in this experiment to the students who were given both the scores and the comments? Is it A, gain of 30%, like the comments, but attitude all positive? Was it a gain of 30%, top kids positive, bottom kids negative? Was it gain of 0, attitude all positive? Was it gain of 0, high achieving kids positive, low achieving kids negative? Or was it something else? What happened in this study is that D is what happened. The children who got the high scores didn't need to read the comments, and the children who got the low scores didn't want to read the comments. And yet giving a mark and a comment is the single most prevalent form of feedback we have in this country. This study and others like it show that if you're going to write a careful, detailed comment and then go and put a score or a grade, you're wasting your time. The high achievers don't need to read it, the low achievers don't want to read it. You'd be better off just giving a score. They won't learn anything, but you will save yourselves a heck of a lot of marking time. One of the very simplest things you can do is just give them the comment one day and the mark the next day. We know that if you put the comment and the score side by side, yeah? When you're given a comment and a score side by side, what's the first thing the kids look at? What's the second thing they look at? Someone else's score. What'd you get? Isn't it? What'd you get? Straight away. All thought of learning has gone out of the window. It's just about how did I do compared to somebody else. What you can do then with the comments is just give them the comment today, the score tomorrow. For a whole 24 hours, they're reading the comment. They're only reading the comment to find out what the score is going to be, but at least they're reading the comment. Let me go on to a second study that gives us a parallel on this topic. Here there were 8 classrooms doing divergent thinking tasks, and there were in 2 classrooms the kids were given comments, in 2 they were given grades, in 2 classrooms they were given written praise as they worked, and in 2 classrooms they were given absolutely no feedback whatsoever. Now what's interesting is the 2 classrooms given grades and the 2 classrooms given praise made the same amount of progress as the control group. Giving grades and giving praise was no more effective than giving absolutely no feedback whatsoever. The only classrooms which made significantly greater progress were the 2 classrooms where they were given comments. So much for this thing we hear that children need to know where they are. Yeah? Well, children know where they are. What they don't need is to be reminded of it all the time. And yet, if they can get that phrase, if they can get that score, they want it, don't they? What did I get? What level did I get? And you know what? We are just the same. In the days before I gave up trying to lose weight, when I'd been good, I wanted feedback. I know you're only meant to weigh yourself once a week, but after a day on lettuce, you want to know this is working, don't you? So you get on the scales, and if you've lost weight, you feel good, and you don't want to eat. But if you haven't lost weight, or even worse, you put weight on, you get depressed and go looking for the nearest cake shop, don't you? I understand the psychology. I want that feedback, but I only want it if it's going to be good, and I don't know if it's going to be good until I get it. It's the eternal triumph of hope over experience. I've just gone in detail over 2 studies that showed that certain kinds of feedback are helpful, certain kinds of feedback are unhelpful. But you might say, I was selective in the studies I chose. So that's why I think you ought to know about this piece of work by 2 guys called Kluger and Denisi, who in 1996 reviewed all the research reports they could find on the effects of feedback in schools, colleges, and in workplaces. They then rejected all the studies that weren't methodologically sound, where there weren't proper controls, where there wasn't a measurement of performance before and afterwards, without details of how big an improvement in performance they got. And they were left with just 131 out of 3,000 research reports that were methodologically sound. On average, they found that feedback was effective. The effect size of 0.4 equates to a 50% increase in the rate of learning. But they found very different sizes of effects in different studies. And the most surprising thing they found was that in 50 out of the 131 studies, the effect of feedback was negative. That means in 2 out of every 5 carefully controlled scientific studies, giving people feedback made their performance worse than it would have been had you given them no feedback at all. In 2 out of every 5 of these studies, you would have been better off shutting up than giving feedback. Feedback made people worse. As you might imagine, they were quite puzzled by this, so they went and looked at the kinds of feedback, and they found that all the negative feedback was basically ego-involving. You're a good employee, you're a bad employee. You're a good student, you're a bad student. Here's an A, here's an F. Typically, they found that those who got high scores didn't get any better. Those who got negative or low scores got very slightly worse. The distinctive feature of the feedback that made people better was, firstly, that it said this is what you have to do to improve, and secondly, and perhaps more importantly, this is how to go about it. To have a feedback system, it's formative only if the information fed back is actually used in closing the gap. If you want to know, you want to ask your students, why don't you try this? Ask your students, how did you use the feedback I gave you to get better? If they can't tell you, the chances are the feedback you're giving them is not formative. It's telling them that they need to improve, but not how to improve. That's why frequent feedback is not necessarily formative. Even feedback that causes improvement is not necessarily formative. If I say to a student, you need to work harder, and they do work harder, and as a result get better, then my feedback caused the improvement, but it wasn't formative because I left the task of working out what to do entirely to the student. It's formative only if the information is used by the learner in making improvements that actually take their own learning forward, and that's why, to be formative, assessment must include a recipe for future action. The key idea here, feedback, is that it should cause thinking. We saw earlier examples of feedback that didn't cause a cognitive engagement, they caused an emotional or affective engagement. How did I do compared to my friends? The key thing you've got to do with feedback is keep the focus on the learning. So how do you get the focus on the learning? There's no one way to do this. Comment-only marking or grading, obviously. Focus grading I talked about earlier, giving less feedback, but making students more accountable for doing something with it. Explicit reference to mark schemes and scoring guides. I'm amazed at the number of teachers who put up success criteria on the wall, but never refer to it in their feedback. One teacher, an MFL teacher, just has a series of 2-letter codes that she uses whenever children make the same mistake, like agreement between the noun and the adjective. She just put a 2-letter code, and she's got a poster on the wall which actually just explains all these codes. So you see kids looking at their marked books and they're going sort of trying to work out what they got wrong. But it saves the teacher a lot of time. Maths teachers said to us, this comment-only marking is all very well, but it doesn't work in maths. Because if I tick 15 as correct and 5 of them as wrong, the children can work out for themselves they got 15 out of 20, even if I don't tell them that. So we said, why don't you just tell the children that 5 of them are wrong? You find them, you fix them. And so if you've got a series of short sentence answers to a French exercise, you can actually just tell them 5 of these are wrong. Feedback should always cause more work for the students than it causes you to give it. So not giving complete solutions. Always leave something for them to do. And retiming assessment. If you're going to have tests, why have them at the end? It's too late. Why not have the test 2/3 of the way through the topic? Science teachers in Japan do that. In science, in middle schools, each topic is allocated 14 class periods. But the content is only allowed to take up 11. In period 12, the kids will do a quiz or a test. The teacher does not mark the quiz. The teacher just reads through the quiz answers and decides on the basis of what she sees to plan lessons 13 and 14. The really important thing is to focus on what can you do to make the learning better.